Welcome back to our ongoing coverage of the 2024 U.S. election. So far, Republican nominee Donald Trump has cast his ballot in Florida, expressing that he feels very confident as the results remain on a knife's edge. Meanwhile, the FBI has issued warnings about two fake videos spreading election misinformation. Additionally, flooding has knocked out power at one polling site in Missouri, making it difficult for voters to reach other locations and closing dozens of roads across the state.
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? I
don't think so. You are rightly impatient for change. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrail.
This election is a choice between whether we will have 4 more years of incompetence or whether we'll begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country.
Consequences of him ever being president again are brutally serious.
She's actually not as smart. And we will make America great again.
And when we fight, we win.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has said that she is confident in continued good U.S. relations after election. Sheinbaum added that Mexico will not comment on the outcome of the U.S. election until the electoral authorities formally declared a winner. Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris has urged everyone to vote before polls close and has stated that her campaign has gained significant momentum and is now focused on the future. She promised to work on reducing prices and taxes for the middle class, emphasizing that the current election will be a turning point for the United States. Harris highlighted the stark contrast between her vision and that of Republican candidate Donald Trump, stressing that her focus is on progress and investing in the American people's ambitions. Republican presidential nominee and former President Donald Trump has cast his vote at the Morton and Barbara Mandel Recreation Center in Florida. Trump was accompanied by former First Lady Melania Trump as he took questions from reporters about the state of his campaign and the possibility that a winner might not be determined by the end of the night. Trump scoffed at the idea that a final result would not be known by the end of the night, even as he acknowledged it was possible. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, has warned Americans about 2 new fake videos falsely citing terror threats and voter fraud, the latest in a string of disinformation that officials expect will intensify as voters head to the polls on Election Day and in the weeks afterwards. One fabricated video purporting to be from the federal law enforcement agency falsely cited a high terror threat and urged Americans to vote remotely, while another video includes a fake press release alleging to be from the agency and alleging rigged voting among inmates in 5 prisons. The FBI announced that both videos are not authentic, stating that such activities aim to undermine the democratic process and erode trust in the electoral system. And tonight, we welcome from Pennsylvania the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for House Affairs, Mr. Joel Rubin, to discuss election day dynamics. Welcome, sir, to our special coverage of the U.S. election. And, sir, how do you assess Kamala Harris's current chances of winning the presidency? What key factors are influencing her position in the race?
Well, it's great to be with you from Pennsylvania live on the campaign trail. And I would much rather be Kamala Harris right now than Donald Trump. That's for sure. She is doing well nationally. She's doing well in the swing states. And here in Pennsylvania, where I've spent the last 10 days, there's a lot of enthusiasm for her on the ticket, and in particular amongst the undecided voters. And that's a critical component of this election, because we're looking at swing states being decided by a very narrow margin. And it's those last minute deciders, those undecideds who then decide, that are going for Kamala Harris by more than 10 points. And that could very well put her in the White House next year.
Mr. Rubin, given your previous experience in the federal government, what challenges do you foresee Harris facing with Congress if she becomes president, especially in terms of bipartisan cooperation?
You know, there's something about the presidency that gives it an authority that even when Congress is divided, and it's quite possible that we will have a Republican Senate, meaning it would change power, and a Democratic House, meaning that would change power. But when you have a president in the White House, it's a very powerful perch. And there are many issues that the American people care deeply about that have longstanding bipartisan support, but have been blocked in the past year in particular by Donald Trump for political purposes. And the number one issue that I believe she would tackle would actually be the question of immigration, where there was a bipartisan agreement in the Senate that was going to tackle immigration, and that was stopped because Donald Trump did not want to resolve the issue because he needed it for the campaign. That's something she could work on quickly. She can also work on many economic development measures, tax credits for people starting businesses and buying homes, and really work on some of the core issues that Americans care about right now related to immigration and the economy.
How has Harris's time as vice president shaped her credibility and qualifications as a potential president? Do you think that this experience boosts her chances in the race?
She's got a strong Washington experience, but she's still relatively new in Washington. She got to Washington in 2017, so that's only 7 or so years ago. But she was a senator. She did work in the Congress for 3 solid years. She has relationships across the aisle. And as vice president, she also was officially the president of the Senate. And she cast many tie-breaking votes while in the Senate. So she understands the institution. She does, if she gets the House that's Democratic, she would have a strong ally there. And so it's going to be about finding senators across the aisle who she can work with. And I think after Donald Trump loses, and I expect he will, that will be a window of opportunity for the Republican Party to come back to normal, traditional Republican policy making without his political pressure from behind. And so we may see a lot of opportunities for bipartisan consensus. One last thing I should say, she has the broadest coalition of support I've ever seen for a presidential candidate. She has former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was a Republican vice president, as well as Bernie Sanders, the most progressive senator in Congress, both on her side. So she has built a very broad campaign coalition that will help her as a governing coalition as well.
I would take from your expectations, Mr. Rubin, if she wins, what areas do you believe Kamala Harris would prioritize in her policy agenda if she wins the presidency, according to your expectations?
Her priorities are going to be some key issues that the voters care deeply about that are supporting her. The first one, of course, is the question of abortion and women's health care and women's rights, and the goal of getting legislation to restore abortion rights in this country that were taken away by the Supreme Court. After that, we are looking, of course, at key questions of the economy and of ensuring that the tax code is working in a manner that's fair, that there are tax breaks given to new businesses, new first-time home buyers as well. We're also looking at healthcare issues more broadly and strengthening healthcare, strengthening the ability of Americans to access healthcare. And I do think on foreign affairs as well. We're going to see a lot of initiatives. She has been a strong ally of Ukraine, as well as a strong supporter of Israel. She's also been a strong voice for Middle East peace. And so we may very well see her take some initiatives in that area, as only a commander-in-chief can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of foreign policy, what shifts or continuities might we expect from a Harris administration compared to the current policies?
Much of her agenda is identical to President Biden's agenda, without a doubt. She is the sitting vice president. Sorry for the noise. We're outside a polling station here. She's the sitting vice president. She is, of course, one of the decision makers alongside the president on his foreign policy. And so I think we're going to see her really strengthen American support for Ukraine in the months of her first term. And we'll also see moves by her to try to find a pathway out of the war between Israel and Hamas and to get the hostages back, to get a ceasefire, to move on diplomatic roads towards peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I can see that as a high priority. And then the third, of course, is the question of China. And China has broad bipartisan support for a strong policy on China, but she is very, very smart about the use of diplomacy and building up our allies and our relations abroad. And so strengthening our alliances abroad, especially related to China, would also be a high priority.
Given the current political climate, how would you assess Donald Trump's chances of winning the presidency in the upcoming election?
Well, obviously, we're a very divided country, and clearly Donald Trump has significant support. The challenge for him is that he is losing in the polls, even in the swing states. And there's a sense amongst Democrats that these polls are also biased towards Republicans. And I can explain why. The short answer is because they are manufacturing many polls and populating the public discussion with that. And so we'll see. But the problem here is that Donald Trump is already talking as if the election was stolen before even any votes were cast. And he's trying to discredit the American electoral process. And that's not just an anti-American position, but it's also not true. Our elections are free and fair and safe. And when there are problems, as you appropriately described in the voting, those will be dealt with in the legal manner. And if it needs to go to court, they will go to court. But Donald Trump and his team have been preparing to try to sue, to prevent votes from being counted, to prevent mail-in ballots from being counted, to try to prevent where likely more Democrats are voting, where they actually get their ballots counted. That will not work, but he's discrediting the program and the elections. And that's unfortunate. To me, that also shows that he doesn't have a lot of confidence that he'll win.
How do you view Trump's relationship with his voter base? Do you think that it will be sufficient to secure his victory in the elections?
Well, I do think he has strong support amongst his voters. They're very passionate about him. The challenge for Donald Trump has always been about how to go beyond his most passionate supporters and expand it to moderates. And only in the last week, we have seen a falling back of that approach. In fact, he had a very devastating rally, his closing rally at Madison Square Garden a little over a week ago, where many of his speakers used racist language, one even calling Puerto Rico an island of garbage, offending Puerto Ricans who are American citizens. And the third largest group of Puerto Ricans in the United States live in the swing state of Pennsylvania. That had a major negative impact on his campaign and his ability to convince independents and people who are undecided that he has what it takes to continue to be serving in the White House. Mm-hmm. And so I think for him, he's having a real hard time convincing new voters to join his side.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Rubin, my final question to you. If Trump wins the elections, what would be his top
Yes.
legislative priorities, and how do you foresee these impacting his relationship with Congress?
Well, as we discussed, immigration may very well be his first priority, but it will not look anything like what Kamala Harris is proposing, which is a smart, sophisticated, pragmatic approach to dealing with our border crisis. What Donald Trump has promised to do is to deport millions of Americans. So he will immediately plunge the United States into chaos. There will be a massive debate about whether or not that is possible. How will he do it? And we will see a lot of fear spread across the United States, similar to what we saw in 2017 when we had major protest marches like the Women's March in early 2017 after he took office. And when he tried Muslim ban, there were protests against that as well. So we will see a period of chaos as he tries to implement his idea of deporting millions of people who are here in the United States.
Well, that was the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for House Affairs, Mr. Joel Rubin. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us here on Q News. Flooding has disrupted power at a Missouri polling site, hindered access to another, and closed dozens of roads across the state. More than 7 inches of rain fell in some areas over the past few days. Flood and flash flood warnings have been issued across a large part of Missouri, extending from its southwest corner to the St. Louis area in the east. Officials there are now running polling stations using generators, according to the local media reports. Swing states, or the so-called battleground states, play a decisive role in U.S. presidential elections, where close margins and shifting party loyalties shape the race. The United States trade deficit widened sharply in September as businesses boosted imports to meet robust domestic demand in anticipation of higher tariffs on goods. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis said that the trade gap has increased 19.2% to $84.4 billion from a revised $70.8 billion in August as exports fell. Imports jumped by 3% to a record of $352.3 billion. Goods imports advanced 4.0% to $285.0 billion. That was the highest level since March 2022. They were driven by a $4.0 billion rise in imports of consumer goods, reflecting mostly pharmaceutical preparations. At an expo in Shanghai, delegates from the U.S. agricultural sector have expressed hope that trade relations with China will improve regardless of the outcome of the U.S. election. The 7th China International Import Expo opened on Monday, featuring 14 U.S. exhibitors from various sectors, including U.S. state governments, national-level agricultural associations, food exports, manufacturing, and packaging. Exports were disrupted by a trade war that began in 2018 with Chinese buyers seeking import sources elsewhere and were then disrupted by the global pandemic. Oil prices have increased by almost 1% as markets anticipate a tightly contested U.S. presidential election. Brent crude futures went up by 0.5% to $75.43 a barrel. The U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude was up by 0.5% at $71.84 a barrel. Gold prices rose as investors await the results of the U.S. presidential election, with polls indicating a tight race between Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump. Spot gold gained 0.2% to reach $2,742.03. The U.S. gold futures rose 0.2% to $2,751.50. World shares had a mixed performance, with U.S. markets showing gains as voters head to the polls to cast their votes. In the United States, the S&P 500 was up 1% and the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 0.8%, while the Nasdaq Composite was 1.3% higher. In Europe, Germany's DAX edged 0.1% higher, while the CAC 40 in Paris and the FTSE 100 both essentially unchanged. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng jumped 2.1%, while the Shanghai Composite Index surged 2.3%. Japan's Nikkei 225 Index gained 1.1%, and South Korea's Kospi fell 0.4%. The race for the White House is coming to an end, with the world watching closely. Both Trump and Harris would reshape international policies with their approach to the U.S. economy. But would each win mean for the global economy?
As election day begins, the economic visions of both candidates are clear, but analysts warn of rising deficits and inflation risks regardless of the winner. Goldman Sachs cautions that Trump's proposed 10 to 20% tariffs on imports could raise core inflation, with large-scale deportations potentially cutting GDP by up to 12%. Harris, meanwhile, favors fair trade policies, with labor and environmental protections, arguing Trump's tariffs could cost families an estimated $4,000 per year. Meanwhile, JP Morgan estimates a 60 to 70% chance of Trump victory, driving G10 currency volatility to new highs 10 to 30% above 2016 and 2020 levels. They project a 5% dollar rise if Republicans sweep and a 1.5 to 2% bump if Trump wins with a split Congress. A Harris win with divided Congress, however, could weaken the dollar. Fiscal projections vary significantly. The Penn budget model sees Trump's tax cuts and spending boosting the deficit by $5.8 trillion over a decade, while Harris's plan adds $1.2 trillion. Both candidates' plans are expected to add trillions in debt, with the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimating Trump at $7.8 trillion and Harris's at $4 trillion. In a recent letter, 23 U.S. Nobel-winning economists endorsed Harris's approach as superior. The fiscal path forward remains complex, regardless of who prevails.
For further analysis on the economic impact of the U.S. elections, we're now joined from Cairo by an expert on American affairs, Mr. Atif Saadawi. Welcome to Q News, sir. Sir, how do each candidate's tax proposals differ in terms of income tax, capital gains, and corporate profits? And what could this mean for the middle-income households? Sir, can you hear me? Sir, how do each candidate's tax proposals differ in terms of income tax, capital gains, and corporate profits? And what could this mean for the middle-income households?
مساء الخير اولا
I'm happy to be in Qnews. I believe that tax has the priority for the American citizens. They are, and this is why they are. Both of them have explained their economic program, and both of them depends on the weakness points of each of the other candidate. Trump's depends on the current responsibility of current administration, which is Harris a part of this administration in terms of prices, and the figures of the economy have a negative impact, but there are claims about the prices, inflation, taxes. So I believe this is a very critical point for the winner of both candidates.
Sir, what impact might each candidate's tax plans have on disposable income for the average American, and could these changes influence the overall household spending?
I believe both of them have focused on these points to reduce the difficulties of the American citizens.
الأسر الأمريكية وكلاهما قد تبدو ربما متباينة مختلفة، لكن كلاهما هدف أو
Both candidates try to reduce.
That was the expert on American affairs, Mr. Atif Sadawi. Thank you very much for your insights. And from the economy to immigration, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump offer diverging plans for domestic issues shaping the 2024 U.S. election. Voters in Raleigh have headed to the polls to cast their ballots in a race that will likely be decided by 7 battleground states: North Carolina, Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and Wisconsin. Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump are within a percentage point of each other in most national polls. Meanwhile, the line to enter the largest polling station in Raleigh stretched down the sidewalk. Long lines have formed at the polls in Manchester, New Hampshire, as voting began in the U.S. presidential election. Most New Hampshire voting locations opened at 6 Eastern Time, 11 GMT, and are expected to close at 20 Eastern Time, 1 GMT. New Hampshire Secretary of State David Scanlon told local media that he expects a record voter turnout, predicting that some 824,000 votes will be cast in New Hampshire. Electoral symbols serve as powerful visual representations of political parties, helping voters identify their preferred candidates and communicate their values and ideologies during elections. Thank you for joining our special coverage of U.S. Election Day on Q News channel. Stay tuned for updates and analysis as results unfold throughout the night.